The ambulance screeched to a halt at the emergency entrance of Metro Health Medical Center, its siren cutting through the late afternoon traffic of Cleveland like a warning no one could ignore. Inside the hospital, a sudden rush of movement followed. Nurses cleared hallways. A gurney appeared. Voices sharpened, efficient, and urgent. This was not an ordinary admission. The paramedics' report traveled ahead of the patient in fragments: multiple pregnancy, severe distress, unstable vitals, and by the time the doors burst open, the obstetrics team was already waiting. Allison Carter lay on the stretcher, pale and barely conscious, her breathing shallow and uneven. She was heavily pregnant, far beyond what most bodies were meant to carry, and the strain showed in every labored rise of her chest. Triplets. The word alone changed everything. Triplet pregnancies were rare, dangerous, and Allison's condition was deteriorating by the minute. There was no time for lengthy assessments or cautious observation. One look was enough. "She needs surgery now," the tending physician said, already moving alongside the gurney. "Prep the oar." There were no arguments, no delays. Allison was rushed through swinging doors, fluorescent lights streaking above her as the team moved with practiced speed. In the operating room, gloves snapped into place. Instruments were counted, and the anesthesiologist leaned close to Allison's face, speaking calmly as monitors were attached and medication prepared. Allison's eyes fluttered, unfocused, as if she were trying to understand how quickly the world had turned dangerous. Within minutes, the emergency C-section began. The operation was tense but precise. Every second mattered. When the first baby was delivered, a thin cry cut through the room, sharp and unmistakably alive. A collective breath was released. Then the second, then the third. 3 baby boys, small and fragile, were quickly passed to neonatal staff waiting nearby. They were alive, all 3 of them, against the odds. They had made it, but Allison had not. As the babies were stabilized, attention shifted back to the woman on the table. Her blood pressure dropped suddenly. Alarm sounded. A quick exchange of glances passed between the surgeons. She was hemorrhaging, aggressively. The blood loss was severe, and it was happening faster than expected. "We need blood now," the doctor said. A nurse was already on the phone with the hospital blood bank, her voice controlled but urgent. The response came back too quickly, and it was not the one anyone wanted to hear. Allison had a rare blood type. The supply on hand was insufficient. More units were being requested, but transport would take time. Time Allison did not have. The room grew quieter, not from calm, but from concentration. Every movement became deliberate. Compress, suture, monitor. But without blood, the margin for error narrowed to nothing. In another wing of the hospital, Daniel Brooks was finishing his shift in a department far removed from obstetrics. As a hospital orderly, he spent most days transporting patients, cleaning equipment, doing the invisible work that kept the building functioning. He had learned long ago how to move through corridors without drawing attention. That day was no different, until his name was called over the intercom. When the request reached him, it was brief and direct. There was a patient in critical condition, a rare blood type. His blood type. Would he be willing to donate immediately? Daniel did not hesitate. He followed a nurse down the hall, his step steady, his expression unreadable. He did not ask who the patient was, how old she was, or why the situation had become so desperate. None of that mattered. He signed the consent forms without comment, rolled up his sleeve, and sat down. As the transfusion began, the blood that flowed from Daniel to the waiting unit became the difference between life and death. In the operating room, the effect was almost immediate. Allison's vitals stabilized just enough for the team to regain control. The bleeding slowed. The monitors steadied. Slowly, carefully, they brought her back from the edge. By the time the surgery ended, exhaustion settled over the room like a heavy fog. 3 newborn boys lay in warm incubators. Allison was alive, though weak. Her body, pushed beyond its limits, and saved at the last possible moment. Daniel returned to his duties, quietly, saying nothing about what he had done. He did not seek thanks or recognition. He did not even know the woman whose life his blood had just saved. He only knew that somewhere in the hospital, 3 children had taken their first breaths because a stranger had given something of himself without asking for anything in return. 3 new lives had begun, and so, unexpectedly, had another story. Allison's recovery did not follow a clean or comforting rhythm. The surgery had saved her life, but it had taken a heavy toll. For days afterward, she drifted in and out of sleep, her body weak, her thoughts fogged by medication and exhaustion. Each time she woke, the reality returned slowly. The sterile white of the hospital room, the steady beeping of monitors, the dull ache that reminded her how close she had come to dying. Her 3 sons remained under observation in the neonatal unit. They were stable, the doctors said, but small and vulnerable. Allison was allowed to see them only briefly at first. She would lie back against her pillows afterward, replaying the sight of their tiny faces in her mind, clinging to it like proof that everything had been worth it. What unsettled the staff was not Allison's condition. It was her solitude. Days passed, then more days. Nurses rotated through shifts. Doctors checked charts, adjusted medications, delivered updates. And yet, no one ever saw her husband. No anxious pacing in the hallway. No late-night visits. No exhausted man sleeping upright in a chair, afraid to miss a moment. The kind of behavior that usually followed a birth like this, especially a traumatic one, was entirely absent. Whispers began quietly, the way they always did in hospitals. At first, they were cautious, almost sympathetic. Then they grew sharper. "Has anyone seen the father?" one nurse asked during a shift change. "Not once," another replied. Triplets, emergency surgery, blood transfusion, and nothing. Most fathers, after something like this, would have been living in the hallway, sleeping on benches, drinking bad coffee at all hours, waiting for updates as if their own lives were suspended. Allison's room, by contrast, remained quiet. When the questions reached her directly, Allison answered without hesitation. Anthony was busy. He ran his own business. Travel was part of it. He had always been on the move. She explained it with a practiced calm, as if repeating something she had told herself many times before. "He'll come as soon as he can," she said more than once, her voice steady despite the exhaustion beneath it. "This is just a complicated time for him." The staff nodded, though their expressions betrayed doubt. Allison noticed, but chose not to dwell on it. Doubt was dangerous. Doubt led to questions she was not ready to face. Daniel Brooks stopped by occasionally, always briefly, always at the edge of her day. He never lingered. He never intruded. Sometimes he asked how she was feeling. Sometimes he asked about the babies. His tone was careful, respectful, as though he were afraid of crossing an invisible line. Their conversations were simple. How was her strength returning? Whether the doctors were optimistic. How the boys were doing in the neonatal unit. Allison found his presence unexpectedly calming. He did not ask personal questions. He did not offer advice. He simply listened. What she did not know, what almost no one knew, was who Daniel had once been. Years earlier, he had been a physician, a good one, respected, confident, married to a woman he adored, father to a young son whose laughter had filled their home. His life had followed a path that seemed stable and earned, the kind people assumed would continue uninterrupted. Then, one night, a drunk driver crossed the center line. Daniel had not been in the car. He had been at work, finishing a shift, planning dinner. By the time he arrived at the hospital, it was already over. His wife and child were gone. No amount of training, no medical knowledge, no professional distance could protect him from that moment. He never returned to practicing medicine. He told people it was a choice, and in a way it was. But it was also a retreat. He could not stand at bedsides anymore, could not fight death and lose again. Becoming an orderly had been a way to stay near the world he once belonged to without being destroyed by it. Seeing Allison in that bed, and her 3 newborn sons fighting quietly for their place in the world, stirred something he had buried deep. It was not romantic. It was not desire. It was recognition. Fragility. Loss narrowly avoided. Life somehow had gone on. Daniel said nothing about any of this. He asked Allison how she was feeling, then left her to rest. But as he walked away down the long hospital corridor, he felt something unfamiliar moving inside him, an ache that was not pain alone. It was the faint, unsettling reminder that some part of him was still alive. Discharge day arrived with the quiet anticipation that settled over the maternity ward like a held breath. Allison had been preparing herself for it since early morning, smoothing the thin hospital blanket, checking the time again and again. The nurses moved efficiently, finishing paperwork, reviewing instructions, coordinating the final checks for the babies. Everything was ready. One question lingered unspoken among the staff. Would her husband come? The nurses exchanged brief glances as they passed the doorway. Doctors who had followed Allison's case slowed their steps, half expecting disappointment. After everything she had endured, an emergency surgery, a near-fatal hemorrhage, days of fragile recovery, no one would have been surprised if the room remained empty. Then the elevator doors opened. Anthony Carter appeared at the end of the hallway as if on cue, carrying a large bouquet of flowers and several shopping bags stuffed with baby supplies. He wore a confident smile, the kind that suggested nothing had ever truly gone wrong. He walked quickly, purposefully, greeting staff with nods and practiced charm, as though he belonged there. Relief flooded Allison the moment she saw him. He stepped into the room, leaned down and kissed her cheek. His embrace was warm, reassuring, familiar. For a brief moment, the doubts that had hovered at the edge of her thoughts faded. This was her husband, the father of her children. He had come. Nurses watched from the doorway as Anthony admired the babies, bending over the bassinets, marveling aloud at how strong they looked, how perfect. His voice carried easily, confident and pleased. To anyone watching, he looked like a proud, attentive father finally stepping into his role. Allison wanted desperately to believe that this was the beginning of something better. Before they could leave, one of the attending physicians asked Anthony to step aside. The doctor's tone was calm but firm, professional without being cold. He explained what Allison had been through, the severity of the blood loss, the risk she had faced, how narrowly they had avoided tragedy. She's alive because several things went right, the doctor said, and because someone stepped in at exactly the right moment. She's still weak. She'll need support, real support, for a while. Anthony nodded, his expression sober, even concerned. He assured the doctor he understood, that he would take care of everything, that Allison would have whatever she needed. As the doctor stepped away, he gestured toward Daniel Brooks, who stood a short distance back, observing quietly. "This is the man whose blood saved your wife's life," the doctor said. "Without him, the outcome would have been very different." Anthony turned, surprised, then extended his hand enthusiastically. He thanked Daniel, clapping him lightly on the shoulder, calling him a hero. Daniel accepted the gratitude with a small nod, uncomfortable with the attention, but polite enough not to refuse it. What happened next unfolded quickly and irreversibly. Perhaps it was the relief. Perhaps it was the rush of having everything once again under his control. Or perhaps Anthony simply mistook Daniel's quiet demeanor for discretion. Whatever the reason, his voice lowered conspiratorially, his tone shifting from gratitude to familiarity. "Funny how things work out," Anthony said, smiling. "3 babies at once. That kind of thing comes with benefits, you know. Government support for multiple births." People think it's for diapers and cribs. But money's money. Daniel stiffened slightly, unsure where this was going. Anthony continued, undeterred. He spoke casually, almost proudly, as if sharing a clever strategy. He explained that the benefits would solve a pressing problem of his own. A house. Something he had promised someone special. Something he intended to buy as soon as the funds were available. For the kids. Daniel asked carefully. Anthony waved the question away with a dismissive flick of his hand. They're babies. They need milk. That's about it. The rest can wait. The words landed heavily. He went on, lowering his voice further, describing the plan as if it were not only reasonable but smart. A temporary inconvenience. A necessary adjustment. Allison would never need to know the details. Everything would work itself out in the end. Daniel listened in silence, his expression unchanged, but something inside him shifted sharply. The man standing in front of him was not just careless. He was calculating. He was willing to strip his own children of resources meant to protect them, and to do it without hesitation. Daniel glanced toward Allison. She was busy with a nurse, unaware of the conversation unfolding nearby. She looked tired, hopeful, vulnerable. In that moment, Daniel understood something with unsettling clarity. Allison Carter had survived surgery. She had survived blood loss. She had survived the most dangerous day of her life. But the danger had not passed. It had simply changed shape. Daniel knew better than to speak openly. The hallway was busy, voices echoing, nurses moving in and out of rooms. Allison was surrounded by staff, by paperwork, by the careful choreography of discharge. Any attempt to pull her aside, to speak plainly, would have drawn attention. Worse, it might have embarrassed her, or sounded like an accusation she was not ready to hear. So he waited. When the moment came, it was brief and almost invisible. As Allison adjusted the blanket around one of the bassinets, Daniel stepped closer under the pretense of checking something nearby. He did not meet her eyes. He did not say her name. He slipped a small folded note onto the tray beside her bed, light enough to be missed by anyone else, and then he was gone. The note contained only a few lines, written quickly and without flourish. A warning. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to matter. Allison found it later, after the room had emptied and the noise of the ward softened into a distant hum. She picked it up absent-mindedly, assuming it was another instruction sheet, another reminder she would forget the moment she left the hospital. When she unfolded it and read the words, her breath caught. Her first reaction was confusion. The message did not fit with the version of reality she had been holding on to. It contradicted everything she believed about her marriage, about Anthony, about the life she thought she was returning to. Her second reaction was anger. Who would write something like this? And why now, of all times? She had nearly died. She had just brought 3 children into the world. The timing felt cruel, calculated. As she read the note again, she felt a surge of defensiveness rise instinctively. It had to be jealousy, or bitterness, or someone projecting their own failures onto her happiness. Hospitals were full of people carrying their own griefs. It would not be the first time someone had tried to poison another person's joy. She folded the paper tighter, her jaw setting as she searched for explanations that did not threaten what little stability she had left. The idea that Anthony, her husband, the father of her children, could betray her so thoroughly was unthinkable. She had endured loneliness before, absence, long stretches of waiting. But betrayal of this magnitude required a level of deception she could not reconcile with the man she loved. For a brief moment, an uncomfortable thought crossed her mind. Daniel. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the timing was not. He had been present. He had spoken to Anthony. He knew things others did not. The realization unsettled her, bringing with it a flash of embarrassment and disappointment. She had trusted him, at least in the small, careful way one trusted a kind stranger. The possibility that he might harbor resentment, or worse, some hidden motive, stung more than she expected. She closed her eyes and pushed the thought away. No, that was unfair. Daniel had done nothing but help her. He had asked for nothing. She refused to turn gratitude into suspicion. Whatever this note was, it did not deserve the power it was demanding. Allison slipped the paper into the pocket of her robe and focused instead on the sounds coming from the neonatal unit. The soft beeps, the muted footsteps. Her sons were waiting. They needed her attention more than a piece of anonymous paper ever could. She reminded herself that this was a turning point, that things would be different now. Anthony had come for her. He had stood there, smiling, holding flowers, promising support. Perhaps the past had been difficult, but the future did not have to be. Hope, she told herself, was not foolish. It was necessary. Later, as she prepared to leave the hospital, the note resurfaced in her thoughts uninvited, not as certainty, but as a faint discomfort she could not quite dismiss. She did not reread it. She did not show it to anyone. She told herself that giving it more attention would only invite doubt where none was needed. Still, when she finally left Metro Health Medical Center with her 3 newborn sons, the warning traveled with her, folded, hidden, and unresolved. Ignored, yes, but not forgotten. By the second evening at home, Daniel knew the note had not been enough. He had replayed the moment over and over. Allison's face when she would have read it, the confusion that must have followed, the instinctive need to protect the version of her life she believed in. A warning without context was easy to dismiss. He understood that now. Words, spoken plainly, carried a different weight. And if he stayed silent any longer, the consequences would not fall on him. They would fall on her, and on the 3 children who had no voice at all. Daniel waited. He watched from across the street as Anthony's car finally pulled away from the apartment complex, disappearing down the block with practiced speed. Only then did Daniel cross the street and climb the stairs, each step heavier than the last. He knocked once, then again. Allison opened the door with one arm braced against a frame, the other moving instinctively toward the sound of a baby crying somewhere behind her. She looked tired, thinner. The strain of the past days showed clearly now that the hospital's careful order was gone. "Daniel," she said, surprised. "Is something wrong?" He hesitated, already aware of how easily this could go wrong. "I won't take much of your time," he said quietly. I need to talk to you about what your husband said at the hospital." The words landed like a blow. Allison's expression tightened. She stepped back to let him in, but the warmth she had once shown him was gone. The apartment smelled faintly of formula and antiseptic wipes. 3 bassinets lined the living room, the reality of her new life pressing in from every corner. Daniel spoke carefully, choosing each sentence as if it might shatter something fragile. He told her what Anthony had said on discharge day, about the benefits, about the house, about using money meant for the children to solve a private problem. Before he could finish, Allison's composure cracked. "That's not true," she said sharply. "You don't know him. You don't know us." "I heard it myself," Daniel replied. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't certain." Her voice rose, fueled by exhaustion and fear. "Why are you doing this? I didn't ask you to get involved. I didn't ask you to judge my marriage." "This isn't judgment," he said. "It's a warning." She shook her head, anger and disbelief mixing into something close to panic. "You're twisting things. You heard something out of context and decided to turn it into a story. I just gave birth. I almost died. And you think this is the time to come into my home and tell me my husband is some kind of monster?" The front door opened. Anthony stood there, keys still in his hand, surprise flickering briefly across his face before it hardened into irritation. He took in the scene, quickly, Daniel standing near the door, Allison, visibly upset, and made his decision in an instant. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Daniel turned toward him, prepared to repeat what he had already said. He didn't get the chance. Anthony laughed once, short and sharp. "Let me guess," he said, glancing at Allison. "He's been filling your head with nonsense." Allison didn't answer. Her silence was enough. Anthony's tone shifted smoothly, his voice calm, almost reasonable. He addressed Daniel now, not as a husband defending his family, but as a man annoyed by an inconvenience. "I don't know what you think you're doing," he said, "but showing up here like this, uninvited, is completely inappropriate." Daniel tried to respond, but Anthony spoke over him, reshaping the narrative as he went. He described Daniel as a hospital employee who had grown overly familiar, who had mistaken politeness for permission. He suggested resentment, loneliness, a need for attention. "You saved her life," Anthony said, his voice edged with false gratitude. "And I was grateful. But that doesn't give you the right to interfere in our marriage." Allison felt the room tilt slightly. Doubt crept in, subtle and unwelcome. Anthony's words were confident, familiar. They offered an explanation that required less pain than the alternative. Daniel recognized the shift immediately. He saw how easily Anthony's certainty settled into the space Allison had been struggling to protect. He also understood that pushing harder now would only confirm the story Anthony was telling. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Daniel said quietly. "I just wanted you to know the truth." Anthony scoffed. "Your truth," he corrected. Daniel nodded once. "That's all I can give you." He left before the argument could escalate further, closing the door behind him with deliberate restraint. In the hallway he paused briefly, then continued down the stairs without looking back. Inside the apartment, Anthony exhaled slowly and turned to Allison. His anger softened, replaced by something quieter and more dangerous. He spoke of stress, of misunderstandings, of how people projected their failures onto others. He asked why she would ever doubt him, whether she trusted a stranger more than her own husband. Allison apologized without fully understanding why. The argument ended without resolution, but something fundamental had shifted. The trust that had once existed, however imperfect, now carried fractures that could not be unseen. The marriage did not collapse that night, but it broke, silently and beyond repair. After leaving Allison's apartment, Daniel did not allow himself the comfort of regret. The confrontation had failed, but it had also clarified something he could no longer ignore. Words alone would never be enough. Anthony Carter was skilled at shaping doubt, at bending perception just enough to protect himself. If the truth was going to surface, it would have to come with proof. Daniel changed tactics. He began quietly, the way he had learned to do everything since his life had split in 2 years earlier. He reached out to people he had not spoken to in a long time, former colleagues, acquaintances from his years as a physician, men and women who had since moved into law, administration, and consulting. He did not dramatize the situation. He asked careful questions, hypothetical ones, about government assistance, about the restrictions placed on benefits for multiple births, about how such funds could and could not be used. The answers came back slowly, but consistently. There were rules, strict ones. Benefits meant for children could not be diverted freely. Housing assistance, if approved, came with oversight. Misuse was not only unethical, it was illegal. Anyone attempting to manipulate the system would need guidance, legal advice, someone willing to explain where the lines were and how closely one could walk them without crossing outright. Daniel asked one more question. Had anyone, recently, requested such advice? The pause on the other end of the line was brief, but telling. Then a name surfaced. Anthony Carter. The confirmation left Daniel cold. Not because he had doubted the truth, but because hearing it stripped away the last layer of uncertainty. Anthony had not spoken recklessly at the hospital. He had been planning, preparing, acting with intent, and he had not been alone. Another name appeared in the notes attached to the inquiry. A woman, not Allison, Lily Monroe. Daniel stared at the name for a long time after the call ended. He did not recognize it, but that, too, meant something. Allison had never mentioned a Lily. There was no cousin, no business partner, no friend with that name. The implication was unmistakable. Finding Lily took less effort than he expected. Anthony had not been cautious. He had spoken openly, made promises, left traces behind him without considering who might follow them. Within a day, Daniel had an address. He went there in the early evening, after work, when the city was settling into the muted rhythms of traffic and routine. The building was modest, clean, ordinary, the kind of place someone lived when they were waiting for something better. Lily answered the door herself. She was younger than Daniel had imagined. Not naive exactly, but open in a way that suggested she believed the world generally made sense. Her eyes widened when Daniel introduced himself, confusion crossing her face. "I'm sorry," she said cautiously. "Do I know you?" "No," Daniel replied, "but I know Anthony Carter." The name changed everything. She stiffened, then relaxed slightly, assuming, as people often did, that there was an innocent explanation, a business matter, a misunderstanding. She invited him inside, still unaware of what was coming. Daniel did not sit. He told her the truth as plainly as he could, without cruelty and without embellishment. He told her Anthony was married, that his wife had nearly died giving birth, that 3 newborn boys were now sleeping in a small apartment, dependent on a mother who was still recovering. Lily's face drained of color. "That's not possible," she said, her voice unsteady. "He would have told me." Daniel continued, gently but firmly. He explained the hospital, the discharge day, the conversation he had overheard, the benefits Anthony intended to use, the house he had promised her. For a long moment, Lily said nothing. She sat down slowly, as if her body had lost its ability to support her. Her hands trembled as she pressed them together, trying to anchor herself to something solid. "He said he was single," she whispered. "He said he was building a future. With me." Daniel watched the realization spread, painful and unavoidable. The pieces began to rearrange themselves in her mind. The unanswered calls, the excuses, the refusal to bring her to his home, the insistence on secrecy framed as privacy, the house, the promise that had felt like commitment now revealed itself as theft. "That money," Lily said quietly, "it wasn't his." "No," Daniel replied. "It was meant for his children." Tears came then, sudden and uncontrolled. Not dramatic, but deep, the kind that followed the collapse of something carefully believed in. Lily covered her face, ashamed not of what she had done, but of how completely she had trusted. When she finally looked up, her expression had changed. The shock remained, but it was joined now by clarity. "Everything he told me," she said slowly. "I need to question all of it." Daniel nodded. That was all he had hoped for. He stood to leave, offering no advice, no direction. This was not his decision to make. He had come only to return the truth to someone it had been stolen from. As he stepped back into the Cleveland evening, Daniel felt no relief, only the quiet certainty that a door had been opened, one that Anthony could not close again. The lies had begun to unravel, and this time they would not be contained. Lily did not wait long after Daniel left. She sat alone in her apartment for nearly an hour, replaying every conversation she had ever had with Anthony, every promise, every carefully worded explanation that had once sounded reasonable. Now, stripped of context, those words felt rehearsed, strategic. The certainty that settled over her was quiet but absolute. She needed to hear his voice. She needed to look at him when she asked the questions he had never expected. Anthony arrived later that evening, confident as ever, greeting her with a smile that faltered the moment he saw her face. "What's wrong?" he asked, already defensive. Lily did not ease into it. She did not soften the truth to spare him. She asked him directly if he was married, if he had 3 newborn sons, if his wife had nearly died giving birth. The denial came instantly. He laughed, sharp and incredulous, as if the accusation itself were an insult. He called it absurd, malicious. He demanded to know who had filled her head with such nonsense. His voice rose as he spoke, pushing back hard, overwhelming her with certainty. "You're really going to believe this," he said, "after everything we've talked about?" When Lily pressed him, he shifted tactics. His tone hardened. He accused her of spying, of insecurity, of trying to sabotage what they had. He spoke quickly, aggressively, giving her no space to think. "You don't trust me," he said. "That's the problem here." Lily held her ground. "Then take me to your home," she said. "Show me where you live. Show me your family. If you're telling the truth, it should be easy." The request exposed him. Anthony froze for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Lily to see it. Then he shook his head, scoffing as if she had crossed some unreasonable line. "This is unbelievable," he snapped. "Now you want proof? You want to inspect my life like I'm on trial." "You promised me a future," Lily said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "You promised me a house, a family, and now you're telling me I can't even see where you live." Anthony turned the accusation back on her, accusing her of paranoia, of destroying their relationship with baseless suspicion. He painted himself as the victim, wounded by her lack of faith. But Lily no longer listened for reassurance. She listened for truth, and she heard none. "I can't do this," she said finally. "I can't be with someone who lies like this." Anthony's expression darkened. He raised his voice, trying one last time to force compliance through anger. When that failed, he switched to contempt, dismissing her pain as weakness, her questions as manipulation. Lily opened the door. "Leave," she said. Anthony stormed out without another word. He drove home in a fury that fed on itself, his thoughts spiraling faster with every mile. Lily's questions echoed in his head, not because they were unfair, but because they were dangerous. Someone had spoken. Someone had interfered. And there was only one person who could have done it. By the time he reached the apartment, his anger had sharpened into something volatile. He burst through the door without warning. Allison looked up from the couch, startled. One of the babies began to cry, sensing the shift in the room before any words were spoken. Anthony's face was flushed, his movements erratic. He began accusing her immediately of talking, of inviting strangers into their lives, of betraying him. "What did you tell him?" he demanded. "What did you say?" Allison tried to calm him, insisting she had told no one anything. Her voice shook as she spoke. Anthony did not listen. He paced the room, his words tumbling out in sharp, reckless bursts. He grabbed a bottle from the kitchen and drank directly from it, the smell of alcohol filling the air. The accusations grew wilder. He questioned the baby's paternity. He mocked her dependence. He twisted her silence into guilt. "You've been against me from the start," he said. "You and your little allies." Allison's fear rose quickly, cold and immediate. She recognized this version of him, the one shaped by anger and drink, unpredictable and cruel. She clutched the edge of the couch, her eyes darting toward the bassinets. Anthony slammed the bottle down and turned on her fully. "Get out," he said. She stared at him, not understanding. "I said get out," he repeated louder now. "Take them and leave. I don't want you here." The room seemed to close in on her. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up. She stood, moving mechanically, gathering the babies with shaking hands. One cried louder. Another whimpered softly. Her heart pounded, so hard she could hear it. Anthony watched without intervening, his expression hard, almost triumphant. "Leave the keys," he added. Allison did not argue. She did not plead. She understood, with sudden clarity, that staying was no longer an option. Fear had overridden hope entirely. She bundled the babies into the stroller as quickly as she could, her movements clumsy with panic and exhaustion. When she stepped into the hallway, the apartment door closed behind her with a final, hollow sound. Outside, the air was cold. The city lights blurred through tears she did not bother wiping away. Allison stood there for a moment, gripping the stroller, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. She did not know where she was going. She only knew that she could not go back. With nowhere else to turn, she pushed forward into the night, carrying her children away from the only home they had known. Driven by fear and by the instinct to keep them alive at any cost, Allison pushed the stroller without direction, her movements guided more by instinct than thought. The city stretched around her in muted tones, streetlights humming, traffic thinning, storefronts closing for the night. Each step felt unreal, as if she had stepped out of her own life and into someone else's. The babies slept fitfully, unaware of how suddenly everything had changed. She told herself she would figure something out. A shelter, a hospital, somewhere warm, somewhere safe. But every option felt distant and uncertain, and the weight of the stroller seemed to grow heavier with each block she crossed. Her body was still weak. Her hands shook. She had no plan beyond staying upright. She slowed near the edge of the hospital grounds, drawn back by familiarity more than logic. The lights of MetroHealth Medical Center glowed ahead, steady and indifferent, the same place where everything had begun. That was when she saw them. Daniel stood near the entrance, speaking quietly with someone beside him. Lily Monroe turned at the sound of the stroller wheels and froze when she recognized Allison. The moment stretched, taut with unspoken understanding. Then Lily stepped forward, her expression already fractured by guilt. "Allison," she said softly, "I have been trying to find you." Allison stopped, her breath catching. For a split second, fear flared again. Fear of confrontation, of blame, of another truth she was not strong enough to carry. But Lily's face held no accusation, only regret. "I didn't know," Lily said quickly. "About you, about the babies. I swear I didn't know. I would never have been part of something like that if I had." The words came in a rush, as if Lily were afraid she might lose the chance to say them. Allison listened in silence, her mind struggling to catch up. Daniel stood back, giving them space, his presence steady but unobtrusive. "What happened?" Daniel asked quietly, though the answer was already written in Allison's posture. "He threw us out," Allison said. The sentence felt flat, stripped of emotion by exhaustion. "He was drinking. He told us to leave." Lily covered her mouth, shock cutting through her composure. Tears filled her eyes, and when she spoke again, her voice trembled. "This is my fault. If I hadn't confronted him—" "No," Allison interrupted, firmer than she felt. "It isn't." The truth settled between them slowly, piece by piece. The lies Anthony had told, the plans he had made, the money he intended to take, the way he had turned on both of them when exposed. As the story unfolded, there was no rivalry, no resentment, only the shared realization that they had both been deceived by the same man. "I'm so sorry," Lily said again. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to know I never meant to hurt you." Allison nodded. Forgiveness felt like a word from another life, but understanding came more easily. They were not enemies. They never had been. Lily hesitated, then gestured toward the street. "You can stay with me. My apartment is small, but we'll make it work, even if it's just for a few nights." Daniel shook his head gently. "That's generous," he said, "but it's not necessary." Both women turned toward him. "My place has room," he continued, "and my mother is there. She'll help. You don't need to keep moving tonight. Allison's instinct was to refuse. She had already taken too much, asked too little, received too much anyway. But her body betrayed her hesitation. She swayed, slightly, and Daniel stepped closer without touching her, ready to catch her if she fell. You don't have to decide anything beyond tonight, he said. Just somewhere safe. They drove together, the city slipping past in quiet stretches of road. Allison watched the window, holding one of the babies close, her thoughts dull with fatigue. When they arrived, the building was modest but warm, lights glowing softly behind the windows. Margaret Brooks opened the door before Daniel could knock. She took in the scene in a single glance. The stroller, the pale young woman, the three tiny faces, and her expression shifted instantly. There were no questions, no hesitation. She stepped aside and ushered them in. Come in, she said. You must be freezing. Margaret moved with purpose, clearing space, bringing blankets, filling the room with gentle efficiency. She spoke to the babies as if they were already familiar to her, her voice steady and affectionate. When Allison tried to apologize, to explain, Margaret waved it away. You're safe here, she said simply. Something inside Allison finally loosened. For the first time since the birth, since the sirens, the surgery, the fear, she allowed herself to breathe. She sat down, surrounded by quiet movement and soft voices, and felt the constant tension in her chest ease. This was not the life she had imagined, but as the night settled around them, and the babies slept under the watchful eyes of strangers who were beginning to feel like something else, Allison understood that shelter did not always come from where one expected it. Sometimes family was chosen, and sometimes it arrived just in time. Anthony did not disappear quietly. Humiliation curdled into anger, and anger demanded a target. He had lost control of the narrative, over Lily, over Allison, over the future he had planned without regard for anyone but himself. Someone had exposed him, and in Anthony's mind there was no ambiguity about who deserved punishment. Daniel Brooks. Anthony moved quickly, the way people did when they believed speed could replace truth. He made phone calls, leaned on acquaintances, revived connections he had kept precisely for moments like this. The story he told was carefully constructed, plausible enough to sound serious, vague enough to be difficult to disprove. He accused Daniel of misconduct at the hospital, of exploiting access, of crossing professional boundaries. Nothing dramatic, nothing that required evidence, just enough doubt to make administrators uneasy. Within days, Daniel was called into an office and asked questions he had not anticipated. The process was formal and personal. He answered honestly, calmly, believing that truth would protect him. It did not. The hospital chose caution over loyalty. Daniel was dismissed pending investigation. His badge collected, his access revoked. The word termination was not used, but the meaning was clear enough. When he left the building for the last time, it was not with anger, but with the heavy recognition of a familiar loss. At home, the consequences arrived swiftly. Daniel's savings were modest. His income as an orderly had never been generous, and what he had managed to put aside had already gone toward baby supplies, medical needs, and the sudden expansion of their household. Margaret's pension helped, but it was limited. Within weeks, the margins tightened to something frighteningly thin. Allison felt the strain acutely. She woke early, calculating costs before she even sat up. Formula, diapers, transportation. The quiet fear of running out hovered constantly, sharpening every decision. She tried to contribute where she could, navigating paperwork for assistance, filling out forms while the babies slept in brief, fragile stretches. In the midst of it all, she began preparing divorce paperwork. The decision surprised no one but Anthony, who called repeatedly, alternating between threats and sudden, pleading apologies. Allison did not answer. She moved through the process with an efficiency that came not from confidence, but from clarity. She wanted out. Completely. When the question of property and child support arose, the lawyer paused, surprised by her response. "No," Allison said without hesitation. "I don't want anything from him." The lawyer warned her of the implications of what she was legally entitled to, of what refusing could mean down the line. Allison listened politely, then shook her head. "I don't want to spend years tied to him through money," she said. "Freedom is worth more." It was not an act of martyrdom. It was a choice, one she made deliberately. Daniel protested when he learned of it, arguing quietly that she had every right. Allison met his concern with a calm resolve that surprised even herself. "I won't let him control us from a distance," she said. "This ends now." As weeks passed, the household settled into a fragile routine. Margaret remained a steady presence, never complaining, never intruding, quietly managing what she could. Lily visited often, helping with the babies, bringing groceries when she could afford them, offering her time when she had nothing else to give. Her presence was unobtrusive, respectful, as if she were still trying to earn the right to belong. It was Lily who raised the idea first. "Why don't you apply again?" she asked Daniel one evening, as they sat around the kitchen table, the babies finally asleep. As a physician, Daniel dismissed it immediately. He had done that once before, returned to medicine, and it had broken him. He did not trust himself to survive the weight of it again. Margaret listened quietly, then spoke. "You didn't stop being a doctor because you failed," she said gently. "You stopped because you were grieving." The words lingered in the air. Lily added nothing more, but the suggestion took root. Over the following days, encouragement came in small, careful ways. A job listing left open on the table. A reminder that his license was still valid. That hospitals needed experienced physicians. That perhaps the time had come to reclaim what had been taken from him, not by Anthony, but by loss. Daniel resisted until practicality forced his hand. They needed stability. The children deserved more than survival, and against his fear, there was a quiet pull inside him, a sense that returning to medicine might no longer feel like punishment. He applied. The interview process was swift. His record spoke for itself. His skills had not disappeared, only gone unused. When the offer came, it arrived without ceremony, a simple phone call that altered the course of their lives. Daniel accepted. The first day back was difficult. He moved carefully, reacquainting himself with routines, with responsibility, with the intimacy of patient care. But as the days passed, something unexpected happened. The work no longer hollowed him out. It grounded him. At home, the change was immediate. The tension eased. Bills were paid. Plans could be made again. Margaret smiled more. Lily laughed without hesitation. Allison watched Daniel with quiet gratitude, recognizing the resilience it took to stand back up after being deliberately pushed down. Anthony heard the news eventually, that Daniel was working again, that Allison had filed for divorce and wanted nothing from him, that his attempt at revenge had not destroyed anyone but himself. He did not respond. Quiet justice did not announce itself. It arrived without spectacle, without confrontation. It simply unfolded, steady and irreversible. And as winter edged toward spring, the life Anthony had tried to dismantle continued, stronger, clearer, and finally beyond his reach. The divorce was finalized without ceremony. Allison signed the papers in a quiet office, her hand steady, her expression calm. There were no arguments left to be had, no possessions to divide, no lingering negotiations over money or custody. Anthony did not attend the final meeting. His absence felt appropriate, almost symbolic. By then, he had already begun to fade from her life, not as a dramatic villain brought low, but as something smaller and less significant, a voice that no longer reached her, a presence that no longer mattered. When the paperwork was complete, Allison stepped outside into the cool Cleveland air and felt something lift from her chest. The fear that had followed her since the night she left the apartment loosened its grip. She was no longer reacting. She was choosing. At home, life continued in small, meaningful rhythms, feedings and nap schedules, doctor's appointments and quiet evenings. The babies grew stronger, their cries fuller, their movements more certain. The house, once crowded with tension, settled into a steadier kind of noise, the sound of life being lived without vigilance. Daniel did not rush what came next. He moved with the same care he had shown from the beginning, never assuming, never pressing. But commitment, when it arrived, was clear and deliberate. One evening, after the children were asleep and the kitchen lights had been dimmed, he spoke simply. "I want to build this with you," he told Allison. "If you'll let me." There was no speech, no promise that life would be easy, only the certainty that he was choosing her, and the children, fully without conditions. Allison did not answer immediately. She looked around the room instead, at the evidence of the life they had already begun to share. The toys scattered near the couch, the soft hum of the baby monitor, Margaret's quiet movements in the next room, humming to herself as she folded laundry. "Yes," she said finally. From that moment on, the household felt anchored in something solid. Daniel stepped into fatherhood not as a replacement, but as a presence, steady, attentive, patient. He learned each child's rhythms, their small preferences, the differences that made them individuals even as infants. The role did not overwhelm him. It grounded him. Lily remained part of their lives in a way that felt natural rather than forced. She visited often, sometimes to help, sometimes just to sit and talk. She never tried to claim space that wasn't hers. She simply stayed. Over time, the awkwardness dissolved, replaced by familiarity and trust. The revelation came quietly, almost by accident. One afternoon, as wedding plans were being discussed in passing, Lily mentioned her father, his name, his work, the way he had drifted in and out of her childhood. Allison paused. The details were too familiar. A name she had heard before, a pattern she recognized. They compared what little they knew. The truth emerged slowly, unmistakably. The same man, different lives, different years, two daughters who had grown up separate, unaware of each other's existence, half-sisters. The discovery did not shock them as much as it might have once. There was no anger left to fuel it, no rivalry. Only a strange, quiet understanding. The connection felt less like a revelation and more like confirmation, an explanation for why their lives had intersected the way they had. They laughed eventually, then they cried, and then they moved on, folding the truth into the family they had already chosen. Margaret accepted it all without surprise. She had lived long enough to know that families were rarely simple and almost never accidental. She watched the house fill with warmth again and felt something she had not allowed herself to hope for after losing so much. This home was no longer defined by ownership or control. No one claimed anyone else as property. No one stayed out of obligation or fear. The bonds that formed here were voluntary, renewed daily through care and presence. When someone struggled, others stepped in. When someone needed space, it was given. Anthony's name stopped coming up entirely. He existed somewhere beyond the edges of their lives, irrelevant not because he had been punished, but because he no longer had access. The power he once believed he held dissolved quietly, rendered meaningless by a family that had learned to function without him. As seasons passed, the house settled into its own rhythm. Laughter returned. Peace followed. Healing did not arrive all at once, but it came steadily, built on trust and choice rather than force. And in that ordinary, hard-won happiness, a truth became clear. Family was not defined by blood alone. It was not secured by money or obligation. It was defined by who stayed, by who protected, by who chose love even when it cost them something. And that, at last, was enough.